And it goes on that Ariel Levy called it fearless. Greg Easterbrook, who wrote the Progress Paradox, A Moment on Earth, called it urgent. Somebody from the Department of Energy called it dangerous. Another, Michael Pollan, who wrote The Omnivore's Dilemma, called it bracing. Roger Pielke, who wrote The Honest Broker, who's a professor at University of Colorado, described it as a great book, more than environmental politics, an alternative to the politics of limits and divisiveness. It really is, I think, an outstanding book. And Michael has been the president of the Breakthrough Institute, which is in Oakland, since 2003, when he formed it with his colleague Ted Nordhaus. It's a policy staff. They have an annual conference, a policy journal, and a network of affiliated fellows. And later this year, they will present their paradigm, what's it called, the award to Jesse Ossival, our speaker from last week. And they get a lot of coverage for the kinds of things that come out of their institute by National Public Radio, Wall Street Journal, C-SPAN, and many other places. They argue that instead of policies that, like cap and trade, that would increase the cost of energy, we should be investing in technologies to make clean energy cheap. And I think that is a very important strategy we need to pay much more attention to. The writings of Michael, they've been both praised and criticized, and I've told you some of the ones who have praised it. The former Sierra Club executive director, Carl Pope, wrote, "I'm deeply disappointed and angered by the death of environmentalism." If you haven't read that, you should. Because most of the people in this room, and I include myself, consider us that we are environmentalists, and but many of us believe that in the Anthropocene, we need a different kind of environmentalism, and I think that Michael is an advocate for that. Michael was raised in a Mennonite household in Colorado. He went to Earlham College, which is a Quaker school in Richmond, Indiana. Went on to get a master's degree in cultural anthropology from UC Santa Cruz, and he lives in the San Francisco Bay Area. And Michael, it's great to have you here at the Aquarium of the Pacific. Please join me in welcoming him. There are 2 seats up here. Okay. Everybody have a seat? And we still have 1 or 2. All right.
Thank you, Jerry. Thank you very much for inviting me and for having me. I don't know if I need that one. So we'll dive right in. Jerry mentioned that we're offering a new paradigm of nature protection and human development. After calling it post-environmentalism for a number of years, and people said that's such a lame name. You need a better name than that. Slate magazine called us eco-modernists, and we thought that had a nice ring to it, so that's what we're going with. So let's start with the stories that we tell about humans and the environment. There's a story that, the dominant story is a story that we're all really familiar with. The idea is that we used to live in a state of grace, or state of harmony with nature. This is, of course, the story that's culturalists. So the idea was, well, before we all had to become farmers, we just lived off the bounty of the land,
and there was a kind of harmony, a kind of stasis, an eternal quality of it. And then the great sin, of course, was to eat from the tree of knowledge. And you can read that as a metaphor for the advent of agriculture and the use of tools to do what before had been provided by God. This story shows up in environmental books starting about 50 years ago, including Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring. She writes, but instead of the harmony being in hunter-gatherer societies before the rise of agriculture, it was actually, in this case, in small-scale farms and agriculture. And in the book she writes, all of life seemed to live in harmony with its surroundings. It's an opening parable to Silent Spring where she's describing how life was perfect and harmonious until the arrival of pesticides, when the birds stopped singing and it was a silent spring. And it was the beginning of really humankind's fall from that state of grace. Of course, it even goes much older than Judeo-Christianity. This is, of course, the Greek myth of Icarus and his father Daedalus, who attempted to be like gods through the use of technology, in this case of wings. And of course, Icarus was sorely punished for it. He flew too close to the sun being a metaphor for Apollo, for the gods, for knowledge, for technology, and for power. So it's a story that is warning of human hubris and warning of technology. So it's really a very early story against technology and against human ambition and creativity. And of course, this is the great, I try to use the best art I can find, this is the great Matisse of Icarus. Another wonderful Greek myth that is also a cautionary tale is the story of Prometheus. In some stories, Prometheus creates humans. In other stories, humans were created by the gods, and Prometheus felt pity on humans because we had no claws, we had no way to protect ourselves, we were these defenseless creatures. So Prometheus stole fire from the gods and gave it to humans. But this act was, of course, punished. He was chained to a rock by Zeus and every day had his liver eaten out by vultures. And then, of course, we know how the story ends. It ends with the expulsion from the Garden of Eden. The world is now fallen. This is the great Masaccio painting of the expulsion from the Garden of Eden. And really all suffering that we now experience in the world, all of the problems we can trace back to this original sin of using technology, of human hubris, of human creativity to try to conquer nature and provide, to do the work that really the gods or God should have been doing for us. Again, the story is told constantly in one of the most important environmental books of the late 20th century, and I think arguably the most important book to popularize climate change by Bill McKibben is called The End of Nature. And the idea is that that all might look like nature that you see around you, but it's not real nature. The real nature is gone forever because of atmospheric forcings that have created global warming. So, and recently Naomi Klein, who's an environmentalist, she writes for The Nation magazine, she was in British Columbia watching the orcas, and there's some evidence, and I don't know the full story, but basically there was a phytoplankton bloom that was created by an entrepreneur who dumped iron fillings in the ocean, and it created this bloom and a comeback of salmon and the orcas. And she said, I can't even enjoy these orcas because they are a sign of really that we've corrupted nature. These orcas shouldn't be here because we created them. So the idea is that we live in a state of fall. And we all know how that book ends, that book being the Bible. It ends in the book of Revelations. The word Revelations is, it comes from the Greek word apocalypse. People think of apocalypse as just sort of the end of the world, but actually it is the revelation. So it's a passageway into a new world. And so it's not just that this world ends, it's that a new world begins. And of course, it'll be a fiery end. But afterwards, those who have faith will be restored to a state of grace and harmony. And we'll get back to where we've been. And this is the basic narrative architecture of the environmental story. Once we harmonize ourselves with nature, then these environmental problems will go away. And you can see, again, in Inconvenient Truth, here the references are explicit. Al Gore said, in reference to Hurricane Katrina in 2005, it was almost like a nature hike through the book of Revelation. The truth about the climate crisis is an inconvenient one. That means we're going to have to change the way we live our lives. We're going to, in order to achieve that, that state of grace and that harmony with nature, we're going to have material sacrifice and downgrading of our quality of life so that we can be in that state of harmony. The sacrifice, of course, being older than Christianity. Now, we'll pause here. Now we're going to kind of let that narrative go for a minute. And I want to introduce a different figure. Everybody knows who the gentleman on the right is. That's His Holiness the Dalai Lama. Very few people know who the gentleman on the left is. Actually, I'm curious, does anybody know who that is on the left? Anybody? It's on the tip of your tongue? Yeah? No, his name is Aaron Beck, and he is the inventor of something called cognitive therapy. Well, I'm in LA, so everyone must know what cognitive therapy is. I'm from Berkeley, so everybody's in cognitive therapy. He was actually a classically trained Freudian psychoanalyst, and he was working with his depressed patients, and he found that traditional Freudian psychoanalysis, which involves the idea is that psychological issues that you're having, mental health issues, unhappiness, depression, are related to something in your childhood. That's the idea. And he found that tracing people's back to their childhood experiences wasn't working for his depressed patients. It just they weren't getting over their depression. So he tried to do something just radically different. He said, I'm just going to forget everything I know about Freudian psychology. I'm going to listen to what my depressed patients are telling me. And I'm going to see what they're saying to me and what it has in common with each other. What are they saying? What's the pattern here? And he found that all depressed people share three core beliefs. My world is bleak, I'm no good, and my future is hopeless. So does this sound familiar? What's that?
Environmentalism.
It's not just environmentalism, of course. It's really it's the same narrative structure of all of those all those early human stories that I was telling, from the Greeks to Judeo-Christianity to environmentalism. It's also in Marxist philosophy. As a college-age Marxist, I know Marxism pretty well. Marxism says something very similar. It's actually a Christian narrative. It says the world is bleak because we're living under capitalist exploitation. I'm no good because I'm being exploited and I'm part of this terrible system, and the future is hopeless. But then it added this other piece to it, which said that there would be an apocalypse, which Marx called a revolution, and afterwards we would have communism, which would be a state of grace and harmony back on Earth. But in this case, depressed people don't ever get to the utopian part. They just stay rooted in this depressed structure. What Aaron Beck did is he invented cognitive therapy, and what that does, that teaches people to talk back to these depressing overgeneralizations and re-narrate their life. So he would actually make people conscious of the ways in which they tell themselves these stories. He would describe it as a voice in their head, a script that they tell themselves, and he would encourage them to just argue back against the voices in their heads. And this is very common now, you hear it a lot, we have multiple selves. There's not just a single Michael, there's many Michaels. They get into little fights during the day. And he would actually have people write it down, what the stories are that I'm telling myself, and then they would argue back against those stories, and lo and behold, it worked. And in fact, cognitive therapy remains, I believe, at least it was a few years ago when we researched this, it is the only therapy that I believe that major insurance companies continue to support, because the demonstration of its empirical efficacy is so high. They do get strong results from doing cognitive therapy with depressed patients. So we view this as the work of the Breakthrough Institute for the environmental movement, is to do a kind of cognitive therapy. And of course, that requires that we start by arguing back against these depressing overgeneralizations and tell a different story about ourselves, our world, and our future. So let's go there now to a different human story. This story starts with what we actually know from the sciences about human and pre-human history. And what we know is that we are natural beings that evolved from the earth through primate pre-human ancestors. And there were important differences. And this is just, you probably may have seen some of the science on this in recent years. This is from an NPR story about a wonderful study that was done that suggests that the reason that we have our wrists is because of technology. So what do I mean by that? Well, so here's from the NPR segment. An ape's fingers, which by the way are these on the left here. An ape's fingers are long and good for hanging from branches, while the human hand on the right has a long, strong thumb that makes the hand more versatile. So for those really long hands, are really good from hanging from branches. But these hands are really, our hands and our special wrist are very good for striking flint, for example, to make arrowheads. So the operating theory right now among many anthropologists, maybe most anthropologists, is that these special wrists that we have were selected for. There were advantages accrued to our pre-human ancestors who had those wrists because they allowed us to do things like make tools, make technologies. So what you start to see in this story is that rather than technology being an external thing to human being, it's actually at the center of who we are. The technologies allowed us to evolve and become who we are. And we know that this evolution, let me stay on this for a minute, was important because we now also know that the use of these tools allowed us to hunt large mammals. In fact, we caused a major extinction of the woolly mammoths and other, during what's known as the Pleistocene extinction, large mammals that we hunted and consumed. And that in doing that, in eating more meat, our brains grew larger, including growing a larger forebrain, a larger frontal cortex, which allows for imagination, allows for foresight, allows for thinking farther into the future. So people complain, sometimes our colleagues in the environmental movement complain that we are just like, we're just dumb primates, we don't have a long enough vision. But in fact, what makes humans different in many ways from other primates is that we are able to imagine the future. And we now also, the operating thinking now is that how did we get these larger brains, that the extra mass had to come from somewhere in our body and that it came from our intestines. So before we ate meat, before we ate cooked meat, we had a very large even larger digestive tracts than we have in order to digest raw meat and vegetation. And that over time, as we were able to eat cooked meat, we were able to consume larger and larger quantities of protein with a smaller and smaller gut, allowing for our brains to grow larger over, of course, many thousands of years. This is the picture that we often have of the Amazon, of nature primeval. The idea was there are parts of the earth that were Edenic, that were untouched by humans and human technologies. But the recent sciences of the early human experience completely defy this. We now know that large areas of the Amazon were being farmed when the Europeans, the Portuguese and the Spaniards came in the early 1500s, the early 16th century, and that they brought with them smallpox that spread all throughout what is now we refer to as Brazil, really wiping out all of these early native populations. And so what we now call this primeval, virgin, forest, all that language, was actually forest growth that came after these human populations died out. Another interesting case of that is the Black Death in Europe in, I believe, the 13th century. When it wiped out 1 to 2/3 of Europe, much of the forests were able to grow back. It was actually one of the things that delayed our transition to coal, which I'll touch on in a little bit. Energy is life. The conversion of natural energy flows and stocks into usable human energies is such a central part of all life on Earth. This metabolism of energy, and you can see very strong correlation between living a longer life and consuming larger quantities of energy. So that's stayed very consistent. My mom grew up in rural Indiana in a Mennonite household just after World War II. She was born in 1939, and she was the youngest of a family of 6. And I always wanted to know what life was like back on the farm, in the olden days. And so she would have me talk to her eldest sister, and I asked her about what their lives were like, and in particular, I was interested in technology. And she said one of her earliest memories, she said, the women worked, 6 days a week, just like the men did, and that like Mondays was like washing clothes, and Tuesdays was like canning, and Wednesdays was cleaning. But she says she'll never forget how excited her mother was when they finally got this ringer here, because the earlier way they were doing it, using their wonderful wrists that we've evolved to have, would just destroy the hands of the women, and incredibly damaging. So even these early technologies, you can see, start to liberate us, and in particular start to liberate women, as recently as the early 20th centuries. And of course, now we see it even more. Some of you may know Hans Rosling, who gives a wonderful talk on TED about washing machines, and when his mother first got a washing machine, how happy she was, because when she had a washing machine, she could spend the time that she would have been washing her clothes reading books, and gaining an education and gaining a sort of sense of control and empowerment over her lives. Early, in the United States, much of what we now call liberalism and human rights and sort of the modern liberal agenda in the 20th century was about energy. So there's FDR signing into law the Tennessee Valley Authority. The Tennessee Valley Authority was actually what happened was during World War I, towards the end of World War I, they wanted to create a factory to manufacture munitions on the Tennessee River in Muscle Shoals, Tennessee. And they built this dam, and they built a munitions factory for the war, and then the war ended. And so Henry Ford showed up and said, well, I'll buy it from you, give it to me for $1, and I'll develop the whole region. And a progressive Republican senator, they actually existed back then, said, no, we should really, this is a public asset, a public good, and we should use this dam and this factory to create, instead of creating ammunition, we're going to create fertilizer, because it's the same process of creating nitrogen or fixing nitrogen from the air. So that was the birth of the Tennessee Valley Authority, and it was considered a major liberal victory. And the idea was that energy is sort of a universal human right, that everybody should have access for energy. And I didn't know it at the time. I always thought of it as sort of a labor thing, as good for poor people. But in fact, it had an explicitly environmental agenda, which was in several respects. The first was, you can see here is the sign here. It says, starved for lack of plant food and nourished by phosphate and lime. So one of the first things that they did is they made fertilizer. But socialist organizing and left-wing ideas were very much alive at this time in American history. So one of the things that TVA did is it co-opted a lot of that grassroots organizing sentiment, and they hired local farmers to actually go out and do the farmer education. So it was very much of the people and by the people. The other thing they did is they did reforestation. Folks don't even realize it now, but at this time in the 20s and 30s in this part of the South, it looked a lot like sub-Saharan Africa looks today. There was malaria, there was deforestation, the soils were leaching their nutrients. So this was an environmental effort as much as it was a human development one. In fact, it's impossible to separate them. And you could see this resulted in this incredible prosperity. By the time you get to World War II, America is clearly the global technological and developmental leader. And then we start to get to the 60s, and something starts to change in the culture. So obviously, one big part of this is that, well, I'll start with just a case here. Does anybody know who the gentleman on the left is? So this is Tom Hayden. He was one of your city council members or state assembly member for many years. He, as a young man, he organized something called the Students for Democratic Society in 1962, and they wrote, this is the birth of the New Left. So they were the New Left because they were breaking with both the communist Marxist left of the 20s and 30s, and they were also breaking with the FDR liberal tradition. So I'm going to read you a quote from the manifesto, the founding document of the Students for Democratic Society, because I think it's so revealing. He says, our monster cities, based historically on the need for mass labor, might now be humanized, broken into smaller communities powered by nuclear energy and arranged according to community decision. So this is the Port Huron, that's Michigan, statement, Students for Democratic Society 62. Just consider for a moment the vision of the New Left in the early 60s was to have suburbs powered by nuclear energy. That was the environmental left-wing vision in 1962. I mean, fast forward to the year 2014, and basically the left vision is the opposite of that. It's to have big cities, dense urban cities. New York, Manhattan, they're all very proud of how energy efficient they are, right? Compared to you Los Angelinos. If you're in Manhattan, you're morally virtuous because you live in a big apartment building, you don't have a car, right? I mean, your New York friends, don't they annoy you when they talk about that? And it would all be powered by renewables and not by nuclear. So you can see something happens between 1962 and today, and trying to figure out what happened becomes an important mystery that we're going to explore. Obviously, something really big happens, which is that we invent the atomic bomb. And it's helpful to remember. I just finished reading The Making of the Atomic Bomb by Richard Rhodes, and it's important to understand. People forget, but the atomic bomb comes at a moment of just horrific bombings and violence. When we are using conventional bombs to bomb Tokyo and to Curtis LeMay is leading these bombings of Japanese cities, obviously of Dresden, and the Germans, of course, and the Japanese were just as terrible. But nonetheless, the birth of the atomic bomb, everybody knew that this was really different, and this really represented technology that could be the end of human civilization. I mean, that really was understood very early by folks. And then the testing for these nuclear weapons went on for just year after year after year. Impossible for an experience like this to occur and for it not to have profound consequences for how we think about technology and how we think about the environment. And so you see a generation of children are taught to duck and cover, and it's a very funny experience. How do you trust your teachers and your schools and even your parents when you just can't believe what they're telling you, that you're going to duck under the desk and you're going to survive a nuclear holocaust, right? I mean, and you don't have to be a grown up. You can be a kid, and you can start to really question whether the authorities are really telling you what is really going to go down if there's a nuclear war. So I think some distrust gets developed. You start to see the environmental movement, and here just recall that in the 1930s, dams are a kind of human liberation, a form of cheap, abundant electricity for restoring the environment and for empowering workers. Fast forward to 1968, many of our rivers had already been dammed at this point, and the environmental movement finally says enough is enough. We're not going to let you dam the Grand Canyon. And David Brower, who's the head of the Sierra Club here, leads a successful effort to prevent the Grand Canyon from being dammed. Same year, 1968, the Sierra Club, which David is the head of, publishes The Population Bomb, where Paul Ehrlich, who's a young ecologist at Stanford, writes that India couldn't possibly feed 200 million more people by 1980. And the opening of this book is really offensive. I mean, I really encourage you to read it for yourselves. He and his family go to India, and they're in the cab on the way from the airport to their hotel, and there's beggars in the street, and they see people in the street. And he really is describing the Indians he's seen as animals in just the most kind of, I think if anybody read it today, it would be offensive to like the liberal, politically correct students at most of your liberal arts schools. But the sense was the world is running out of resources. There's not enough room for all of these people, and in particular, not enough room for all these poor people. That's a very different vision for the left to be taking in the late 60s than the left was taking in the 1930s, just a couple of decades earlier. Hugely influential book. E.F. Schumacher, Small is Beautiful. And I say the book is influential. I think that Small is Beautiful was the change in people's values. That was, the baby boomers they believed small was beautiful, and they had a hatred, big government, big corporations. They're the ones that brought us nuclear bombs, nuclear power plants, and they gravitated to this book, which articulated why big institutions were anathema to human dignity and human freedom. And then this gentleman, his name is Amory Lovins. He was a young energy analyst who became very influential among American environmentalists, including David Brower, in the late 60s and 1970s. And he wrote, after the oil crisis, he wrote a very famous essay in Foreign Affairs, which is a very staid, mainstream journal, arguing that we needed to move away from centralized energy production. And we needed to move to a more local energy production. This would eventually become a vision of renewable energy. But at the time, it was really focused on really your neighborhood ought to be making its own energy. That was the idea. And if you go back and read the essay, and it's very long, I've done the hard work for you all, and very boring. There's actually a very paranoid line that runs through it. So here's something he says in it. He says, the book is, the essay is making an attack on not just like big oil, but also on big utilities. The idea was that the electrical grid is sort of a sinister thing because it's controlled by the man. So he says, in an electrical world, your lifeline comes not from an understandable neighborhood technology run by people you know who are at your own social level, but rather from an alien, remote, and perhaps humiliatingly uncontrollable technology run by faraway, bureaucratized technical elite who have probably never heard of you. And the innovation in this essay, he says it's also unstable. The next sentence actually just got too long, but the next sentence he says, a single rifleman could create a blackout that would just devastate a city, and then there would be riots, and it reminded me, when I read this essay, it reminded me of those movies that my dad would make me watch when in the early 80s, all those paranoid 1970s movies, like Robert Redford was in them, and like Flight of the Conchord. I mean, you guys probably remember better than I do. There was this sense in which there was a shadowy presence that was behind the scenes orchestrating things. If it wasn't a real conspiracy, it was the system. And so the idea was, don't trust people, don't trust the people that are providing this electricity for you because they don't know you. And you really, again, you got to get back to that small is beautiful, the small and local is beautiful. My friend Mike Lind, who's a very good American historian, says you can see the change in values in the two most important in the science fiction of the era. Look at what's happening in the science fiction, not for what the future is going to be, but just look at in the science fiction for what's happening now. So Star Trek, Gene Roddenberry's classic. This is a movie about United Nations blue helmets, right? I mean, these guys are cosmopolitan elites. They're racially diverse. There's even an interracial romance that occurs. They're using reason and technology. Remember, technology is a friend. You have something wrong with you, they point this little magic thing at you and it fixes you. So technology is benevolent. They have a benevolent mission. They're out to kind of be protectors. And if you saw the last Star Wars movie, you remember that the first directive is very Margaret Mead-ish. Do not interfere in the authentic development of a culture. So very, was that the Prime Directive? Yeah, very, very much an idealistic view of technology and modernization processes. Well, you move forward to Star Wars, which was the film of more of my generation, and the bad guy is technology. Remember, he's more machine than man now. That was what Obi-Wan Kenobi said about Darth Vader, is that he's more machine than man now. And that was a sign of his sinisterness, that he had lost his humanity in technology. And so instead of technology in our story being essential to what it means to be human, because it was essential to human creation and the creation of humans by pre-humans, it was something alien and sinister in that same vision. And of course, the good guy is a mystic, is a monk. He'll have a lightsaber, but mostly he's using spiritual forces, magical forces, and the good guys are these sort of primitive little teddy bears who are very low tech. So you can see that something really big is happening just between late 60s and late 70s. Meanwhile, of course, the world continues to just happen on its own without regard for the stories that we tell about it. You've seen some of these already from Jesse and Jerry. Agriculture being just continues to astound us with just how much more. This is bushels per acre. Just how much more food we're able to make on the same amount of land. Hybrid genetics and biotechnology have driven a 5-fold increase in average U.S. corn yield since 1940. As for the population bomb, you can see already in 1968, when that book came out, you can see that food is pulling away from overall population size. So were already making more food. And of course, Amartya Sen would win the Nobel Prize in 1980 for showing that famines were caused by political conflicts, not by not having enough food. And you see that in certain parts of Africa where one faction will try to deprive the other faction of food by cutting off access to roads. That's where famines come from. When we look at these famines on TV and we think, oh, they didn't grow enough food that year, that's just a mythology that Amartya Sen showed was false. Now, of course, we've got new challenges. Population is at 7 billion today. It's going to go to 9 or 10 billion, though I think likely we'll hit 9 or 10 billion and then decline. And there's a bunch of reasons to think that it will peak in this century and then start to decline. A huge challenge, and one that we'll focus on a bit here, on the opportunity side, is obviously that we're all going to get a lot wealthier. Everyone's going to the developing world is going to become the developed world. But it is going to create a lot of new pressures in terms of carbon dioxide emissions and other harms to the natural environment. Obviously, this is not a negotiable matter for the poor in the world who are still, without electricity, without washing machines. They're going to get those things. They're not asking us for permission. So if you just do some basic analysis, just some basic arithmetic, you can see here that here's how much energy we consume today. This just means the Energy Information Agency. That's where this comes from. So we consume 500 quads of energy a year in electricity and in fuels. It's projected that by 2035, the world will be consuming about 50% more than that. But if you just think about what it would take for everybody to live at Bulgarian energy consumption levels, we're almost going to double total global energy consumption. If everybody were to live at German energy levels, Germany is about twice as efficient as we are. They use about half the amount of energy we do, and they still have really good lives, so that might be a good thing. And if everybody lived at US levels, we would more than quadruple how much energy we consume. But even if you kind of kept us at Bulgaria or German levels, there's no question the world is going to consume a lot more energy over the next century. And obviously this is going to create a bunch of challenges in terms of CO2. I'll come back to this, but basically if you want to keep to what the United Nations says is the target that we should have, which is 450 parts per million of carbon in the atmosphere, you would have to build one new nuclear power plant or its equivalent in solar or wind or some other zero carbon energy. So one nuclear power plant is about 1 million homes with solar panels on them. To give you, that's a kind of a good rule of thumb. It's actually about 900,000, but about 1 million. So you'd have to do that every day from now until 2050. And there's pretty good reasons to think most of the people that we know that look at this just think that's not going to happen. But that is what you would have to do given the energy. So it's good to just kind of keep that in mind. So, one question is there's just a lot of folks, and certainly we too, until fairly recently, had the idea that, well, we just need to move to renewable sources of energy, like solar and wind and geothermal and tidal, but not dams, because dams are bad, and not biomass, because that's burning wood. So just mostly wind and the sun. And so one of the things that we did is we after we kind of got clear that maybe that wasn't going to happen, we thought, well, where does that idea come from, that we could power the whole world on renewable energy? Because all ideas have a history. So we just went into the New York Times website, and they have this wonderful thing of all of the New York Times articles ever since the New York Times has been around for like 150 years. So we found, one of the first mentions of it, 1977, solar power is already a bargain. 1977, we basically have all the solar technology we need. We were like, wow, that's amazing. Can we go farther back than that? So we found an article in the New York Times. And we found the writings of this gentleman, Barry Commoner, who's a founder of the modern environmental movement. He said, all of the solar energy technologies that can replace gaseous, liquid, and solid fossil fuels are in hand. Some are already economically competitive with conventional sources, and many are rapidly approaching that point. So already in 1975, we had all the solar energy that could apparently power society. I'm going to come back to this. I will just flag this two words here, in hand. It's a very important allusion in that sentence. We kept going back. 1956, New York Times has a wonderful article, A Limitless Resource, Solar Energy. It talks about how we have the technology to power the society on solar energy. This is the New York Times. This is not some marginal newspaper. 1935, new solar engine gives cheap power. And it's the Smithsonian secretary. He says, this apparatus, he says, solves the dream of science. It's just done. The technology is there, 1935, to power all of society with solar energy. Well, it keeps going. 1934, after coal is going to be the sun, and it's a professor at Columbia University. So again, it's not some podunk people here. These are major thinkers saying that we have all the solar energy we need. Well, the day when solar is economical to drive machinery is not unlikely to arrive before long, 1891, from the Washington Star, which was bought by the New York Times. That's why it's there. Well, we traced it all the way back, we think, to this wonderful character. His name is John Etzler. He's a German-American immigrant. And he wrote a book. In it, he says, I promise to show the means through 3 technologies, concentrated solar power, wind, and dams, for creating a paradise within 10 years where everything desirable for human life may be had for every man in superabundance. His book came out in 1833. His book is called The Paradise Within Reach of All Men, Without Labor, by Powers of Nature and Machinery. Ralph Waldo Emerson read this book, and he was like, this is amazing. And he gave it to his friend Henry David Thoreau, and he said, Thoreau, you've got to read this book. I mean, this guy's like an Amory Lovins of his day. He said, this book is amazing. It shows how we can power the whole society on renewables energy, on solar, on the sunlight, and on wind, and on water. And Thoreau read it, and he just said, this is just horrible. And Emerson said, why? What's wrong with it? And Thoreau said, if you did what he is talking about doing, of powering the whole society on renewable energy, you would completely destroy nature. You'd have to dam every river. You'd have to build huge farms of solar collectors and wind farms, because the energy is so diffuse that you have to use up a lot of nature to create much usable energy. That was what Thoreau told Emerson over almost 200 years ago. What you find in this discourse, my father was a divinity doctorate, so I grew up in a very religious, we like talking about religion, you see it everywhere. So what you see here is a promise of paradise. It's within 10 years. The earlier thing I had you pay attention to with Commoner was he said it's at hand. Remember the kingdom of God is at hand. So whenever someone says that something is at hand, grab your wallet. But the idea is that this new reality, this new world, it's not distant, it's close. It's right here. You just have to get your head right. You have to think about it right. And we have to, as a society, work together to realize the promise of this vision that I've gained from these higher powers. So this is a religious vision. And that's not to say that solar panels are bad or that solar panels are religious. I'm looking into getting a rooftop solar system myself. My colleague Ted has a solar system on his roof. There's something really cool about solar panels. But we just need to consider the discourse that they came from, and then we need to consider the empirics of the technology. Anyway, you can still see it, and you find it all over the place. This is the cover of Scientific American. Wind, water, and solar technologies can provide 100% of the world's energy, eliminating all fossil fuels and nuclear. Al Gore, we can do it all within 10 years. There's that magic 10 years again. And I don't think that Al Gore had ever even heard of John Etzler. In fact, we're going to write about it in our book, so hopefully Al will learn about it. I asked my staff to pull the numbers on how much electricity solar provides in the United States, and they showed me the first graph here, and I said, well, I can't see anything there. And I said, can you blow it up bigger? Just 92 to 2002, and I still can't see it. So it's now up to, I believe, 0.2% of total electricity. Our friends always say, well, that's just because of subsidies. It's not, and I'll show you that in a minute. Wind has done a lot better. It's gotten up to 3.5%, but it is worth noting that at that level, it's created some pretty serious backlashes. There's a movie that came out last year with Matt Damon called Promised Land. I don't know if you guys heard of it, about fracking. That movie was originally about a wind farm. In other words, it was about wind developers trying to sell a wind farm. And the screenwriter, they changed it to be about natural gas fracking. They thought that would fit more in line with what its audience was looking for. Here's what James Hansen, he's a famous climate scientist, here's what he says. He says, suggesting that renewables will let us phase rapidly off fossil fuels in the United States, China, India, or the world as a whole is almost the equivalent of believing in the Easter Bunny and the Tooth Fairy. Jim Hansen doesn't mince his words around it. Here's just, this shows you, sorry it's so fuzzy, annual electricity generation from renewable energy in the world, 1980 to 2009. And you can see this big blue part here. This is hydroelectric dams. Hydroelectric dams are the one renewable energy that have been scalable. And of course the consequence is that, well, as Jerry has pointed out, we don't have a lot of steelhead in Los Angeles anymore. One of the consequences has just been the destruction of our river systems. Biomass, which is just burning wood in modern power plants, has done a bit better. Geothermal is in red, wind is in green, and you can't see the solar because it's in pink, but it's there at the top. So most of the renewable, when people talk about renewables, it's a little deceptive because I think people say we can get all our energy from renewables. I think the audience, people think that they're talking about solar panels and wind turbines. But in reality, when we do get power from renewables, it's from dams.
There's nothing from water there. Nothing
Tidal doesn't even show up. It's so small. Yeah. So one of the things about renewables that's important to remember is that it's very diffuse. I'll get to it in a minute, but it's just you can kind of see it. Really, is like there's a lot of energy and a small amount of mass with a fossil fuel or even with uranium, and you have to use up a lot of nature. A lot of those natural energy flows when you're not using energy stocks to create a similar amount of energy. Well, let's take just a step back and what has been the history of energy consumption? Well, this is global energy over the last 200 years, and it tells you a picture that you probably imagine, right? So in 1800, basically, all of us just got almost all of our energy from wood and dung, what's known as biomass. Coal is starting to show up a little bit in the black, and you can see coal just becoming a bigger and bigger part of our energy mix. Oil starts to show up in the early 20th century. Natural gas shows up a couple decades later and becomes bigger and bigger. And you can see nuclear in there in the purple, hydroelectric in the green, and then the non-hydro renewables right there in the top. Here's a different way of looking at it, because one of the things that happens in each of those energy transitions is not just that you substitute your fuels. It's also that you start consuming much more energy from the new fuels. So when you can see here, here's how much, this is just the United States now, here's how much energy we consumed when we just used wood, and just look what happens when you go to coal. Then you're adding in natural gas and oil. Each step of the way, total energy consumption and total per capita energy consumption, it goes up. It's gone up about 20 times over the last 200 years per capita energy consumption. Now this gets to your question about tidal. The key concept here, and maybe Jesse Oswald may have mentioned it, is this concept of energy density. That's a really simple measure. It's just how much energy is in a given amount of a fuel. So in wood, there's about 10 megajoules of energy for every kilo, every 2.2 pounds of wood. When you go to ethanol, it doubles. Coal is 3 times more energy in the same amount of weight, same amount of mass. And then you can see it just goes up, and it makes a huge shift when you go from gas to uranium. So much energy obviously locked in these highly unstable materials like uranium and thorium. So that's an important thing to look at, because if you care about nature and you care about the environment, one of the things you want to do is if you want to leave more of the earth to non-humans, you want to not use up so much of the earth. Or as we point out, environmentalism has had 2 big ideas. The first is that we should shrink the human footprint to make more room on earth for non-humans. And then the other idea is that we should harmonize human civilization with nature. Well, our view as eco-modernists is that the first idea of shrinking the human footprint is the right one. That's a great goal to have, because that way you can leave more of the earth for nature. But the second goal of trying to harmonize human civilization with nature undermines the first goal. By trying to harmonize ourselves with these natural energy flows, and this is Thoreau's insight back over 150 years ago, is that would actually have devastating impacts on the natural environment. Jerry, should we take a little break right now? I see people are kind of getting a little... Are people ready for a little 10-minute break? This is a good stopping point for me, and then I can come back and then finish up.
Then let's do it.
Okay, Thanks, everybody. Sorry. When he became Secretary of the Navy, his bold move was to shift the British Navy's ships from being coal steam powered to being diesel powered, basically, to be powered by petroleum. Because I think he got like a 20 or 30% faster ship, and I believe it ended up being very important for the British Navy to do that. So a bunch of things shifted over, and it's one of the characteristics of energy transitions. The original use of petroleum was for lighting. They would process it into kerosene, which I'll get into in a minute. And it was really going to wipe out the oil industry. John Rockefeller and Standard Oil, they were all very worried about it. And then so the automobile came along at just the right time to save the petroleum industry.
Yeah, they used to throw gasoline away.
Yes,
Yeah.
as a byproduct, yeah.
Could I ask a question about
Sure.
this slide? Because I've seen this slide before, and I feel like comparing energy density of these different things, it's not just apples to oranges, it's like apples to boomerangs. Because solar, all these other fuels, you're consuming that kilogram of material and making electricity that you need to immediately use. That kilogram of solar will be producing electricity for 2 decades or longer.
Well,
It's not really an effective way to compare it.
Well, let me show you the next slide might help a little bit. So this was created by the British government when they decided to build a new nuclear power plant at Hinkley Point, which is this one. And they showed it in terms of, this is a different way to look at the power density question. So this amount of, and by the way, this one plant will provide 7% of Britain's electricity. This is the amount of acreage you would need in terms of solar farms, and this is the amount of wind that you would need to generate the same amount of electricity. So does that explain it better? And you can see it here. This is the 3 big solar farms that we just built in the Mojave Desert. Here they are. There's a golf course, which provides a sort of
That's amazing.
Sorry, that's what?
I just said it's amazing when you drive by that.
Oh, yeah. Have you driven by? Yeah. Yeah. We did an analysis of it, and it's a similar thing. Basically, the footprint of this. It generates. I believe this generates about 1/6 the electricity of Diablo Canyon, which is our last nuclear power station in the United States. So one thing that we've heard a lot of is that energy efficiency is going to allow us to reduce how much energy we consume. And this is a very interesting question because it seems really obvious that if you put in more energy efficient light bulbs, then you will use less energy for lighting, for example. But a funny thing happens in the society, which is that as we move to more energy efficient technology, we also end up using more technology that uses more energy. So this was the Modern Entertainment Center in the 1950s. This is the Modern Entertainment Center today. In fact, it's actually already outdated because the TV is too small. And in fact, the strange thing is actually there's 4 people out of 6 watching the TV, which of course if you have a family and you got a bunch of people, you know that everybody's actually on their own device while the TV is on. So this is a phenomenon known as rebound, which is that as that efficiency is not an energy saver, but it's actually an enabler of greater energy consumption. So here's a wonderful study that was done of lighting. Over the last 3 centuries, and even now, the world spends about 0.72% of its gross domestic product on light. This is an incredible phenomenon. This was the case in the UK in 1700, is the case in the undeveloped world, not on grid electricity in modern times, and is the case for the developed world in modern times using the most advanced lighting technologies. This was a study that was first done by my friend Ted, his uncle, in 1998, but then it's been replicated twice, once by Roger Fouquet, who's a very good historian of energy, and by Sal and Sanders, Sal being at Sandia National Labs. And so what ends up happening? Well, the world is just a lot more illuminated today, right? And so we get more energy efficient lighting, and that saves the amount that we would spend on energy, but we don't just pocket that money or use it for something else. It allows us to actually get more and more lighting. So it's not just the light, think of the lighting on your computer, on your personal devices, the same amount of money, same amount of GDP, and of course the GDP has gone up dramatically. Here's another way of looking at it. In the red is the efficiency of lighting increasing. The price of lighting services, the cost of that lighting has gone down, and thus the total consumption of light goes up. And there's actually, we have a case study coming out. This is true. This phenomenon is true for lighting. It's also true for steel production. So if you go and make, a lot of environmentalists in recent years have been investing to make Chinese steel factories more energy efficient. And the idea is that, well, if we make the steel factory more energy efficient, then they'll use less energy. But I think you can all imagine what actually happens. They're able to make more steel, and there's a lot of pent-up demand for steel in the developing world. And the same thing is also true for electricity generation itself. The generation of electricity, of taking natural energy flows or stocks and converting them into electricity, is itself a process that's become more efficient, but as it's become more efficient, we've consumed much more electricity. This is a study that was done in Great Britain, but it's also been done in every developed country, which is that a lot of, in blue, this is what we say we emit. We say, well, our CO2 emissions have actually gone down as we've reduced how much energy we consume. But of course, over this period of time, the factories went to China. And so if you count the energy that's what they call embodied or embedded in our technologies, our energy consumption and our CO2 emissions have continued to rise. Well, that's really depressing, right? So, okay. What works? Like what really is good for the environment? So what does positive change look like? Well, so one of the models just comes from agriculture. In the blue bars here, this is 1961 to 2009, and we're doing new research that suggests that this actually, it might be this way all the way back to the early 20th century. We have used about the same amount of the Earth's surface for agriculture, which is about 13% of the ice-free surface of the Earth for farming. And look at the yields have increased by 250%. So it's called intensification, which is a really important word. You don't really hear it from traditional environmentalists, but for eco-modernism, this is going to be a very important concept. Create more energy and more food from less nature. That's going to allow us to shrink our footprint. And Jesse Ossibel talked about it last week, I'm sure. The blue whale, I mean, this is one of the most inspiring stories of how humans saved the blue whale. In our forthcoming book, we're going to talk about how humans saved the whales. And we did it twice, actually. We saved them first in the 19th century and then in the 20th century. And it's a more complex story than the one that's been told to date. Here they were. These are just giant, can you imagine, these just giants with just full of resources, mostly used for whale oil, for the oil for lighting, but also they used the baleen for creating corsets and combs. It was just this wonderful material that people had available before there were plastics. The baleen being the I'm going to get this wrong. Jerry's here, so I'm intimidated. It's the thing that allows the water to filter out and the fish to stay back, right? I'm never going to use why did I use this example at an aquarium? Oops. Did I do that wrong? Okay. Okay, thanks. So this is the killer app that saves the whale. It's the use of kerosene for lighting. And it was one of the most rapid energy transitions that's ever occurred. Energy transitions are notoriously slow. So obviously the move from wood and dung to fossil energy is still taking place because there's 1.2 billion people in the world that are still using wood and dung for their primary energy. And the British and even the Chinese started using coal over 500 years ago. So it's a very slow transition, but this one occurred in about 10 years. And you can just see it right here. This is U.S. whale oil and sperm oil imports, 1805, 1905. And this is not because we started running out of whales. This is because of the emergence of kerosene. And in fact, our research shows that if it hadn't been for kerosene, then we would have saved the whales through a different fuel source, which was coal, which was being converted into coal gas fact, the British, I'll show you in a minute, they were already moving away from whale oil to coal gas, which was being piped into people's homes and being used in public lighting. So if kerosene hadn't saved the whales, then coal gas almost certainly would have. Bill Gates, who has dedicated his life now to charity, he recently said, if you gave me only one wish for the next 50 years, I can pick who is president, I can pick a vaccine, or I can pick an energy technology at half the cost with no carbon emissions. This is the wish I would pick. This is the one with the greatest impact. So Bill Gates, we think, really gets it. Honorary eco-modernist. The idea is that energy becomes a master substitute. It's sometimes called the master resource. But with energy, you can make, as we've already seen, you can make fertilizer, which allows you to grow more food on less land. You can avoid using beautiful animals like whales as resources because you can substitute that energy. And if you have cheap, clean energy, we're never going to run out of food. And we're never going to become poor. We're never going to run out of resources. Energy is the master resource. Well, let's look at a case study. Obviously, that all sounds really good in theory, but when you actually are living through an energy transition, it's much more controversial than just hosannas for the energy revolution. But here's the natural gas revolution that we're living under right now. You can see the impact on CO2 emissions is dramatic. This is the amount of carbon dioxide that the United States produces just from our electric sector. So it doesn't count transportation. And you can see a huge drop between 2000 and 2012. Starting in 2000, the natural gas revolution, which is a way of getting a lot of natural gas out of a rock that no one ever thought we could get gas out of, has contributed $100 billion to the economy every year. I don't think that Barack Obama would have been reelected president had there not been a natural gas revolution. Ohio voted for Obama, a big beneficiary. It acted as sort of a second stimulus to the economy. But what's really important about the gas revolution is that it undermines the whole idea that environmental equality comes from sacrifice. And that's not just an environmental idea. Every economist thinks the only way to deal with climate change is through a price on carbon, but through a carbon tax or something that would make fossil energy more expensive. But the most important case study we have over the last several decades comes from a situation where we got a cheaper form of energy. So here's a way to look at it. Oh, I just said all this. Emissions have dropped in the US faster than any other country in the world over the last 5 years. Shale gas is responsible for 50 to 75% of the decline, all while contributing $100 billion annually and supporting the expansion of renewables. So if you love renewables, you should love natural gas because cheap natural gas allows you to back up solar and wind. So when the sun stops shining and the wind stops blowing, in 20 minutes you can ramp up your natural gas electricity generation to replace the generation from wind and solar. Yeah.
So I've heard these arguments too, and I know that natural gas is obviously much cleaner than coal, and certainly from a carbon standpoint, but what's not measured is the impact on our water supplies, groundwater supplies from fracking, and the fugitive emissions of methane from fracking sources, which we haven't even started measuring, and which could really eclipse the gains that we're seeing.
Right. Yeah. So it'll be a couple slides from now. The question is about other impacts of natural gas than CO2. So you can just see here, just to show you this is what a big energy revolution looks like, a big transition. And it was actually going up even before that, in part because of public policies. We've wanted natural gas because it is so much cleaner than coal for a long time. A lot of people say, well, maybe there's not that much natural gas in shale. Shale is a rock about a mile underground. And it is true, in 2011, the US government agency went a little crazy. I don't know what they were smoking that year. But it has consistently gone up in the amount of gas that we think is in those shales. So to your question, I had my staff, we did a report on natural gas. So we looked at all the scientific peer-reviewed literature on comparing the environmental impacts of coal and natural gas. So we first looked at deaths per terawatt hour. Natural gas vastly outperforms coal. Coal mining remains a very dangerous and very dirty source of energy. Life cycle nitrogen oxide emissions, damages from pollutants, mercury emissions. I mean, mercury is a heavy metal, and And coal is a sponge, so it absorbs all these heavy metals in the ground. When you burn it, it goes up into the air, and then it goes into our fish, and then we eat it, and that's how we get mercury. Life cycle CO2 gas is about half of coal. I think you asked a question about water. There's no question that natural gas uses water, but it uses about less than half, I believe, of the fresh water that coal uses. Now, I'm from Colorado, where there's a lot of natural gas development happening, and there are real water resource issues. So it's one thing to say, well, natural gas is better than coal in terms of fresh water, but obviously when natural gas expands into areas that it hasn't been before, it uses the water in those areas. So there are real trade-offs that exist that have to be managed and accounted for, but I do think it's important to have at least a baseline view of the difference between these two fuels. Yeah.
Not just that it uses water, it's that they're injecting chemicals into the ground, thinking that for the purpose of getting down to the gas, but it permeates the water table in unforeseen ways, and suddenly you have an entire water table that's saturated with chemicals and undrinkable. But in every case that that's happened, it wasn't intended. It was an unintended consequence.
So you're right. The first half of what you said is correct. It uses a lot of water, and that is being that's being measured here. This is the fresh water consumed for the production of the gas, and this was for power generation. But the second part is not correct. So there are real pollution issues related to natural gas. You're right that you have to use a lot of water, and they mix with chemicals and sand to open up the shale for the gas to come out. And in states where there's poor regulation or where there's operators who aren't being very ethical, often it's just kind of low-budget operations. They'll sometimes dump that toxic waste legally or illegal, and those regulations need to be put in place. But what's not happening is we're not getting contamination of underground aquifers. In fact, there's only one case where they have found that fracking shale has resulted in some contamination, and it's in a very different shale formation. It's in Wyoming, and it's being hotly contested. It's not even clear whether it was from the shale fracking. But that's the only case of it, and it was in an unusual shale formation. So there's no reason that water tables anywhere should be contaminated with fracking chemicals. Now, there is leakage of natural gas in the gas production process. But the interesting thing to note about it is that, well, there's two interesting things. The first is that the gas leakage is not from the fracking of the shale, which is just cracking and opening up the fractures in the shale. It's actually from the wells that bring the gas to the surface. So if the well is poorly constructed, usually they call it a bad cement job, because you open the earth and you're supposed to cement it down and seal it. If you do that process right, and there's every reason to think that they'll get better at it and standardize it, then you should have very low leakage rates or zero leakage rates. The EPA's official estimate is 1.5% methane leakage. So the other thing is that we know when there is heavy leakage from wells, they're almost all older wells. So the really bad leakage occurred actually well before the shale fracking revolution. And there's been some interesting studies done recently where people will fly a helicopter over natural gas fields and they'll try to locate. And I believe there was one study that was just done, I think the LA Times ran a big story on it recently. And my staff looked at it, and it was something like a tiny percent, I believe it was 1% or less of total wells were the super emitters. So what I would say about it is that methane emission leakage is a problem because it is a potent greenhouse gas. I believe it's 16 times more potent than CO2. And it's a manageable one. The natural gas industry obviously has an interest in capturing the methane because the methane is their product. Methane gas is natural gas. So it is the product that they don't want to lose that. And I think that it is something that will be fixable. And that's why we favor regulations, strong regulations by the states, and if the states aren't going to do it, then the feds ought to do it.
And the fracking companies favor it because they
Yes.
want the poor performance to
Yes.
destroy their industry.
Yeah. The trade-off is, the big companies like Shell and Exxon, they actually they're more. This is one of the things that often our small is beautiful environmental friends don't understand. But the worst actors often are the little guys. They're undercapitalized. They don't have those safety systems set up. So, but it's also been the reason that we've had so much gas so quickly, is because we've had such a we've had so much of a bottoms up, Wild West type situation.
But big companies also outsource to small companies, and then you have things like the oil spill. BP is a huge company, and they
Yes.
blamed it on the company that they hired.
Yeah, and I would also point out that with the BP oil spill, of course, you also had regulatory capture of the agency that was supposed to be regulating the oil industry was in the pocket of the oil industry, and the whole agency was corrupted. What's that?
Is that not going to be the case with natural gas?
It might be. Right now, natural gas is regulated by states, and so there's been some calls for the federal government to regulate it. I think I'm not sure whether I haven't looked at it so extensively to be able to say one way or another way I think the feds should do it. But we have seen a lot of improvement in how these gas operations are happening. And that's not to say there's no problems. It's just saying there's been improvements. And I don't think, we've heard some people say, I have friends who argue and they say, well, gas is just as bad as coal. And I just don't, I think that's just a gross exaggeration. Yeah.
Shell is spending millions of dollars with our company, and we're just a tiny drop in their bucket on making fracking and deep sea stuff much, much, much safer. That was not a Shell well. And their attitude is we're doing the research and sharing it so that it all gets better. So there's a crazy cool attitude out there. Where it comes from, legislation, regulation, backlash, keeping the stuff under cork so you can sell it, something cool is happening. I mean, they're spending a lot of money and sharing it. So that's new.
Well, I think efficiency gains efficiency.
Yeah.
By open sourcing.
Right.
It just helps the whole industry overall. I think that's one of the talks we had last week by the guy from Rockefeller University.
Jesse, yeah.
He pointed out that in this country, we're getting better not from the top down. We're getting better because just the efficiency of doing business.
Yeah.
The cold-hearted big corporations have grandkids, and so the light is finally coming on.
It is a funny, interesting thing. If you read the history of the oil industry in the United States, of course, Rockefeller is portrayed as a really bad guy because he drove out mom and pop operations. But they called it Standard Oil because he was obsessive about standardization. And one of the benefits of standardization was obviously lower cost for the consumers, but the other benefit was safety and health for the workers in the plants and the communities around them. I have a few more slides, and I'll just go through it. Some of our renewables friends say natural gas is really bad for renewables. In the blue is the price of gas, which has obviously come down starting in 2007, 2008. And in the green is wind installations. So you can see there's no correlation. Wind has gone up as gas prices went down. Wind is entirely dependent on how much we subsidize it. People won't do wind without subsidies. When the subsidies were going to get cut off in Congress last year, all new wind projects shut down. So you can't blame cheap gas for anything with the wind industry. Some people will say, well, we're not using that coal now, but we're just going to send that coal off to China or Europe. That's only partly true. In fact, what we found is that we are keeping 7 times more coal in the ground than we're exporting. So this is not a situation where it's like, well, if we're not going to burn that coal, then somebody else says, no, we're actually leaving coal in the ground. It's why we have ambivalence about whether we should export that gas, because one of the benefits of really cheap gas is that it proves our point that you can have energy transitions, which we want to prove that point, but obviously not resulting in more gas. We did a study of where did this gas revolution come from, and I interviewed one of the founders of it, one of the protagonists of it, and he told me, he said, well, I'm conservative as hell, but the Department of Energy did a hell of a lot of work, and I can't give them enough credit for that. DOE started it, and other people took the ball and ran with it. You cannot diminish Department of Energy's involvement. This was sort of the right-hand man to the guy, his name is George Mitchell, who's considered the father of fracking and is one of the pioneers and really led the revolution in the technologies to get a lot of gas out of shales. It's worth taking a minute just to look at how they did it. In the early 70s, we obviously had an oil and gas shortage, a big energy crisis. Huge effort by both the Ford and the Carter administrations for the federal government to just try to get gas out of the ground in other places. They experimented a lot. Grassroots effort of geologists going around and doing demonstration projects. People always knew there was gas in the shale. They just didn't know how to get it out. So it's a technical problem. obviously one of the first things was that these are vertical wells, and in the past, there would just be a pocket of natural gas, and they would just suck it out. Well, so here they're using horizontal drilling, and then they were fracking, opening up the shale here, and then pulling it out. So what happened is that Mitchell, that's George Mitchell, he said, well, I need some help. So he asked DOE if they would pay for the cost difference to do the first horizontal well. And DOE said, yeah, that seems like a good investment. We'll pay the difference for doing a horizontal rather than a vertical well. Then he said, well, we can't really tell where the cracks are, and we need to be able to navigate where you put the well. And so they sent up these guys from Sandia National Labs who used what were called microseismic mapping technologies, underground 3D mapping technologies. Well, where did those technologies come from? Well, they first were coming from the Department of Energy, which was using them to detect coal mine collapses before they occurred to save the lives of coal miners. Well, where did it come from before that? It came from underground nuclear testing. And then what about before that? Well, the technology before that came from tracking submarines. Ultimately, when you trace modern technologies back, they often trace back to World War II and radar. These are land-based. Military is the source of a lot of technological innovation because you're trying to control territory and you're trying to get a better visibility on underground, above ground. And in fact, we haven't done a case study of it yet, but my understanding is that the self-driving cars, the new, which we will all one day be in, use similar technologies that these underground mapping uses, which is land-based radar systems, basically. So all having a common route. There's Halliburton's adaptation of microseismic mapping. Nuclear, obviously, is a technology that comes out of a weapon. It's a government program, the Manhattan Project, really rapidly scaled up. People hate nuclear power. They really do. But it is a technology that produces a lot of power and in a small amount of space. Here's a good way to look at it. This is a global proportion of low-carbon energy. In about 1973, the world got about 6% of its energy, total energy, from low-carbon sources, and basically all of it was hydroelectric. And then look what happens over the next 20 years. That doubles to about 12%. And in the last few years, we've seen renewables taking a bite of nuclear, but the total amount of energy we've gotten has been flat. Here's another way of looking at it. A mathematician in Australia said, well, if you had 10 years, let's take the Etzler thing, we have 10 years to just try to move to zero carbon energy. Which technology has been able to produce more energy in a 10-year scale-up? And the winner is Sweden from 1975 to 1986. They produced 7 times more energy, electrical energy, than Germany did recently when it's scaled up wind and solar. And in fact, France comes in second, Belgium comes in third, United Arab Emirates in its current scaling up of nuclear. So what you get with nuclear, is you get a lot of energy in a very short amount of time. And the problem is people hate it. So land impacts I kind of walked you through before. Here's another way of looking at them. You just need a lot more land to produce the same amount of energy from renewables. Here's the total amount of land that we use that we're set to use in the world for energy in 2050. If we only used renewables, that's how much more land we would use. And that's about the same amount of land that we currently use for agriculture, which is the most environmentally destructive thing that humans do, because you have to wipe out the whole landscape of non-humans. If you used just nuclear, that's how much land you would use. I'm sorry, no, that's 2010. I'm sorry, I mixed up the slides. And that's how much land it would be required for nuclear if we went in 2050. So it's just I guess what I would say is, it's just kind of what do you want? If we don't want nuclear power, then we just need to acknowledge that we're going to end up using a lot more nature to produce energy. And that might be what humans end up wanting, or at least wanting some mix of. But those are some of the trade-offs. People always ask, well, isn't like the difference between nuclear and renewables, subsidies? Well, not really, because and it was hard to figure this question out. So what we did is we compared the most expensive nuclear power plant, like the boondoggle of all nuclear power plants in the world, which is the Finland's Olkiluoto nuclear power plant. It's behind schedule. It's really expensive. It will produce the same amount of electricity as all of Germany's solar panels, a little bit more, but just basically about the same. And then how much will it cost? That will cost $31 billion for those 2 massive nuclear reactors, and German solar program will cost 130. So it's not a matter of subsidies. Here's another way of looking at it: the cost per kilowatt hour of these boondoggle nuclear plants, 7 cents versus 32 cents for Germany. A lot of people say nuclear is dead. Actually, 1 year after Fukushima, Fukushima was 3 years ago. The world is set to build more nuclear power plants today than before Fukushima. So the conventional wisdom on that is just wrong. You see most of the action, though, is in China and Russia, United States. We have very little happening. Some of this just has to do with low electricity demand growth. Deaths by energy source, obviously huge difference between coal, oil, and in all fairness, this doesn't include solar and wind. We did a review of the literature on the safety of renewables, and wind does do better than nuclear. Wind is a bit safer than nuclear, but not solar for reasons that are actually, I could tell you later. Go ahead.
Sorry to take a step back.
That's okay.
The graph of land usage
Yes.
being used, does that include storing nuclear waste materials?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. It's all in. It's life cycle analysis. All of the nuclear waste in the United States that we've produced, that we have, would fit on a football field 4 meters high. So about 12 or 15 feet tall. All of it can fit on a single football field. So there's just not that much waste, and it's easily containable.
Okay, because I had a guest speaker kind of in my class from San Onofre, and he showed us where they're storing their used
Right.
fuel rods, and it was much larger than a football field. Is that because the containment systems that they're using are so large? I mean, he didn't give.
It couldn't have been.
Tell us how much.
Yeah.
Was there, but the picture looked. There were several containers worth of materials that were, taller and wider than a person and much longer.
Were these the dry casks,
It may have.
or was it the cooling pools?
No, it wasn't the cooling pool.
Yeah, the dry. There's no chance that was more than a football field for that plant.
Okay.
Yeah. Though the waste changes over time too, so it may be that it was cooling some, or so it's just hard to know. All right. Yeah. So I'm going to wrap up by kind of running through a couple of things. So obviously, one of the things that we want, because we are concerned about climate change, is we want to see another energy transition happen. This time, a transition to sources of energy that are of less carbon. So one place to look that's very interesting is Britain, because they're always a bit ahead of everybody. And so if you want to look at what a really innovative country has done, you can look at Great Britain. So a great study was done by Roger Fouquet, who's at London School of Economics, and he's found 14 examples of energy transitions in England over the last, I think it's over 400 years. 9 of the 14 cases, the transitions occurred because there was a better technology. A classic example is electricity, just much better way to generate power for a factory, for example, than just having a steam turbine or a water wheel. 5 of the 14 cases, it was a cheaper source. So the classic examples of kerosene replacing whale oil. Half of the cases, greater efficiency of the end-use technology was what pulled the new energy source online. So, and the good news of it all is that he found that the length of the transition has gotten shorter over time. So the longest transition has been from wood and dung to fossil energy. That's just taken a very long time, and you can see we're still in the middle of it for parts of the world. But newer transitions are happening faster, so that's good news if you're concerned about climate change. So one thing is just, well, then what does that mean about how do you make an energy transition happen? Well, the first thing you realize is that the environment has never been a big motivator of energy transitions. Fouquet also did a study looking at whether an environment motivated these changes, and he found it had very small impact And that's been our experience as well, just working on this issue for the last 10 years. The other thing is that it's the new end-use technologies that are needed to increase the demand for the new energy source. What do I mean by end-use? So for example, if we look forward, you go, well, how might you start replacing coal and natural gas with, say, nuclear or solar? Well, one thing is you might increase demand for electricity. Because if you have more demand for electricity, then there'll be more demand for different kinds of power production. So electric cars are like an obvious candidate. If we move to electric cars, that's going to increase the demand for electricity. I like to put in a couple of environmental examples. We might do more desalination plants so we can produce more fresh water for our drought-stricken state, for example. And we might use materials recycling. Right now, we have all the technology we need to basically throw all of our waste into big machines that can then separate out all of the elements that we want. It just requires a lot of energy to do that. So those could all be, if the society wanted or if the economy demanded it, those could all be big drivers of the transition. The other example is that rising mechanization allows for machines and energy to replace labor. So one of the theories about why Britain was one of the first countries to switch from wood to coal is because labor costs were so high, they were looking for more efficient ways to, for the case was in making steel, in iron production. Rising demand for energy. A lot of times people think, well, the older incumbent energy has to become more scarce, it has to run out, it has to become more expensive. In fact, in a lot of these cases, you just get a better, newer technology. We didn't actually have to run out of whales. And in fact, in the 19th century, we didn't run out of whales. We just got kerosene, which was superior. Highly skilled workforce, you also find innovative cultures. That probably sounds very familiar. You have to have a society that wants to create, that wants technological change to get these energy transitions. And government policies help a lot, as we saw in the shale gas example, in the case of the nuclear. In fact, every major technology, solar panels come out of NASA, powering satellites, wind turbines, government subsidies. Basically, every major energy technology had a lot of government assistance. So just to wrap up, what is eco-modernism? It says, hey, the world has not fallen. It's still amazing out there. We still have redwoods. We still have amazing marine life. As all the bad stuff that humans have done in the world, we still have nature, and it's still enchanting and wonderful. And that's a much better place for us to go out in the world and make a difference than in a really depressed place. Depressed stories don't motivate us. I think these stories of how the world is wonderful do. We should embrace the fact that it's going to be a high-energy planet. Energy is not just bad. Energy can be used for good. We want to accelerate energy transitions. We don't want to slow them down. We obviously want to deal with the negative impacts of the expansion of fracking, for example, or of nuclear, of any new energy technology. But mostly, when you get to those new energy sources, they're going to have a lower environmental impact. And we should recognize that there's going to be some trade-offs. Some trade-offs are inevitable. We don't live in a perfect world. And so we've got to find a way to manage those risks and spread them out through the whole society. We want to intensify energy production, not extensify it. We want to produce more energy and food with less nature, not using more nature. And we should just accept that real innovation, it really takes decades. This is not sort of just we're going to all get a bunch of smart guys in a room and figure this out in a few years. It's going to really take decades. A lot of trial and error is the real key. Every innovation scholar will tell you, when do you get a lot of innovation? It's when you get a lot of failure, a lot of it quickly and in a lot of different places. We should look at the rise of the rest, the rise of China and India and Brazil and these poor countries, not as a threat to planetary stability, but as an opportunity. It may be that China is the one that's going to develop the next generation nuclear reactor that can't shut down, that can't melt down. I hope it can shut down. And that we'll want to import that back. So we should be in those cooperative relationships, not just because it's touchy-feely, warm, fuzzy stuff, but because actually we know that innovation requires a lot of information sharing. It requires something called knowledge spillover, where we actually are sharing information, innovators are exchanging views. It speeds up the trial and error process and gets us the kind of innovations that are needed to make for a better world. So thank you very much.
Okay, we have time for some Q&A, and I want to be sure that I get the microphone to you because this is being streamed, and if you don't talk into the microphone, the people who are watching remotely won't be able to hear you. All right, let me wait till I get over here.
So the other
point you raised earlier about the diffuse way that renewable energy, you have to have a large area to generate energy, and you compared it, for example, to a power plant. And the space required is smaller, but for example, a coal power plant, they're literally blowing up mountaintops to get the coal.
Right.
And I'm just wondering if you did that same analysis, but looked at how much area you're decimating to get the equivalent amount of energy, would it be comparable?
Would it be comparable to what?
To say, you had that solar plant example where it was 1/6 the power of the nuclear power plant, but
Right.
if you had a comparable coal power plant, how much acreage of mining would it take to generate the same amount of energy?
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yes. Well, so the first thing to point out is just that so coal has 3 times more energy per mass than wood does. So one of the most underappreciated aspects of coal is the way that coal allowed us to save our forests. And it was most particular in Europe. I mean, the UK was having big wood shortages, but the German government in the 18th and 19th centuries actively promoted coal so that they could protect their forests. I don't know if you've ever seen aerial photographs of the island that comprises both Haiti and the Dominican Republic. You can see that on the left is the Dominican Republic, it's all green, on the right is Haiti. Well, the difference is that the Dominican Republic has fossil fuels and Haiti relies on charcoal and wood for their energy. So your question is, how much more land? I don't know the exact answer to your question of like, if I were to compare like those Ivanpah solar farms to coal plants, how much more land would be devastated? I would say that I would be shocked if you dug up that same amount of area and with coal, that it would generate less electricity than those solar plants. I suspect it would generate more, but I just haven't done the calculations.
Your analysis is life cycle.
But no, wait,
Yes.
nobody can hear you.
Yeah.
I'm sure they're waiting with feedback.
The analysis you showed is life cycle, so it includes mining, it includes all of that.
Right.
It's not just the coal power plant. It
Yes.
includes everything. It's an all-in number. So I know you're shaking your head, and it's very tough because we all come with an expectation to have our biases confirmed. And so you're looking for the nuggets that confirm your bias. Let me tell you mine. So I appreciate your comments about carbon tax or cap and trade. My business is making more efficient cars. And the big problem in our transition is we can double the fuel economy of cars in the next 15 years. That's the plan. We're on course for that. We'll never import as much oil as we did in 2007. It's going to decline every year. The problem is that it's going to get much cheaper to drive. And the cost, the social cost of driving, not only will your wallet impact be significantly less because we'll be more affluent in 15 years, but with autonomous driving, you can, as we saw, read and do other things. So now I can live further out and commute, and that becomes a real challenge. As you said, the rebound effect. We're always using 0.7% or 0.07, I don't remember, for electricity. We use 2 to 3% for fuel for cars. And if that stays at that rate and we double fuel economy, we're going to have enormous amounts of driving. So I think there's a role for taxation to say, we want to tax carbon, and if taxation is the power to destroy. So interested in your thought.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, it's just not a big driver of the innovation. So for example, if we have we have the equivalent of a huge carbon tax in the form of gasoline tax already. Europe has an even bigger one, and yet they still drive internal combustion cars. We get innovation in automotive.
They have significantly higher fuel economy because of that taxation.
Yeah, partly because of the taxation, partly because of regulation, partly because they don't drive as far of distances. They have smaller cars because their commutes are much shorter. There's a bunch of different reasons. But the point is that even that, that's an adoption of innovation question, not an innovation question. In other words, the higher taxes might incentivize you to buy a more fuel efficient car, but higher carbon taxes aren't going to create electric cars. I think you raised a separate question, which I think is very interesting, which is that if you look at autonomous vehicles as an opportunity, rather than like a threat, because I think you're right. In other words, I always wonder if we have a self-driving car, then I might want to get a country home 8 hours away, and I'll leave at night and arrive in the morning and sleep the whole way. How will it change? I mean, it's a very interesting question of how it'll change settlement patterns. But one issue is just, can we see a future where those autonomous cars are more likely to be electric, and that being a new end-use technology that could drive a larger energy transition of the primary energy that we use? Because if we obviously, just produce all that energy, if we power our cars with coal rather than petroleum, it actually is worse for the environment and worse for the impact. So I think it's one of the interesting questions for automotive makers.
Who has the next one?
I will just say too, on your question, calculating how much, calculating the land use impacts of having a coal power plant versus the solar plants is really simple arithmetic to do. I just haven't done it. We were comparing nuclear to those solar thermal plants, but it's easy to do. It's just basic arithmetic. In fact, I'll go home and do it. If you give me your card, I'll figure it out. Yeah.
I'd like you to comment on the possibility of the political environment opening up to the point where we can have this kind of positive collaboration between countries. Recently, I've been to Odessa and to Yalta and to Sebastopol, and now there is confrontation there. And they are destabilizing any efforts they are making in agriculture or anything else, as we all must know. What is your thinking about the possibility of that political environment improving so that we can do these things?
Well, a lot of these things are already happening. So certainly they're not happening enough, but there's a wonderful collaboration between the United States and China on new nuclear plants. It's actually done through both the Department of Energy, UC Berkeley, and MIT. So we should be doing a lot more of that. And I think we should be a lot less worried about, I think we should be much more willing to let that information, the knowledge spill over to occur, because there's a broader public good and public benefit to that innovation occurring. In terms of the situation, one of the big drivers of energy transitions, France and Sweden in the 70s, the reason that they went from, France was burning oil in the 70s, and when the OPEC embargo occurred, France said, we don't want to be victimized anymore. We want to control our own energy destiny. So they already had the nuclear bomb, and they decided, well, we're going to create nuclear power plants for geopolitical reasons. So one of the motivators of energy transitions, of that big government action, is concern around having energy security, since energy is the master resource of the whole economy. So in the case of France, you saw that in the case of Sweden and much of Europe, the transition from fossil fuels to nuclear was driven by concern around geopolitics. And similarly, in the early 70s, that's why we made those initial investments in shale and also started building more nuclear plants, is that we didn't want to be so dependent on importing our energy from abroad. So I would hope that Europe and the United States would look at the situation that's unfolding right now, with Russia and the Ukraine, and say, why would we want to be so dependent on Russia for our natural gas, and start to reconsider the need to go to other forms of energy, whether nuclear or solar or other alternatives. I would hope that would be one of the outcomes that comes from it.
So energy is the great intensifier. You use that term for agriculture and everything else. I think in concentrator, intensifier, use that. But what the key to that is energy. But there are cities and things like that can be very efficient, and every building can have some solar on it. It's shade and it generates power, so there's a mix there. But how intense and concentrated would the ultimate energy solution be? I mean, is it better to have a few incredibly dense, powerful stations that can somehow distribute energy, or where's the balance between distributed and intensely concentrated?
I mean, in one view is that we already have a distributed energy system. I mean, we have a grid. A grid is not a centralized thing. It's a grid is already decentralized with multiple power plants feeding into it. So I mean, I think one question is just whether we would want power plants to get smaller, and that's been the big idea in nuclear for the last 10 years. And the Department of Energy has been funding smaller modular nuclear reactors that are about a fifth the size of the older plants. And there's a bunch of benefits to it, because one of the reasons that nuclear plants got more expensive in the 70s and 80s is because we kept making them bigger. Because one of the advantages of making them bigger is that it is more efficient. But the disadvantage is that for nuclear, the safety systems became more complex and more expensive. So I think one of the things that's happening on nuclear is going to smaller plants. Though I think our view, and we did a report on it, is that the key issue is really moving away from light water reactor designs to designs that are either totally immune from, or much safer in terms of protecting against meltdowns. Because if you can have a much simpler design where the meltdown risk is much lower, then you're going to have a much less expensive nuclear reactor.
Who has the next one? Yes.
I think we're all pretty familiar with how much of an influence oil and gas have on our politics through lobbyists. We never hear about nuclear lobbyists. How does that play a role in the transition towards nuclear? Are there nuclear lobbyists? Are they strong? Do they have any chance against oil and gas? Because it seems like oil and gas are the same business. Lots of the companies that do gas do oil, and there's not a big fear from switching from gas to oil. But nuclear, are the same companies involved? Do they lobby? Are they controlling our politicians the way other companies are?
Yeah, well, let me say a word about my view of the politics here. So when we look at these big energy transitions and these big changes, we see them coming from technological revolutions. So the oil and gas industry is really powerful and rich in the United States and is making a lot of contributions, in part because there was this technological revolution that allowed for the extraction of oil and gas from a new rock underground. And that was driven mostly by a government program that started in the 70s. I also think we overstate the influence of money in politics, frankly. I think there's good reason to think that actually politics has gotten a lot less corrupt. It was actually up until the early part of the 20th century that you could actually just pay senators, a consulting fee. And I don't know if you saw the movie Lincoln recently, but there was all sorts of corruption going on in the 19th and early 20th centuries. And I also think that politicians, what politicians want is they want to get reelected, and certainly you need money to get reelected, but they're just as sensitive to like the big industries that are big employers in their districts than anything else. So I think liberals in particular, I think have talk about this stuff in really simplistic ways that I don't really think reflect how this stuff occurs. So I mean, just to the point is, I don't think we're having a fracking revolution because the oil and gas industry is powerful in Washington. I think we're having a fracking revolution because there was a technological revolution. The nuclear industry right now is weak. They feel defeated. They need cognitive therapy. And the funny thing is, there's not really a nuclear industry. I mean, so there's what it is. So there is a nuclear trade association. It's called the Nuclear Energy Institute, and it's controlled by the utilities. And the problem is that the utilities utilities want to provide reliable, cheap power at a profit. Most of them are private, but the way utilities work is that it's a monopoly. In other words, you don't get to choose who provides your electricity, and the reason is it's a natural monopoly. It doesn't make sense for people to be running separate wires to your home, or the same thing with your sewage and water systems. So they're regulated monopolies. They're not allowed to just raise prices. They have to go to the PUC, the Public Utilities Commission. So the problem is that a lot of the utilities are frankly really happy right now with cheap natural gas, and it's actually resulting in nuclear plants shutting down sooner than they should have been getting shut down, because they're just more expensive to operate than really cheap natural gas. The industry has in recent weeks started an effort to try to save those older plants. They just, Carol Browner, who was Clinton's EPA secretary and was Obama's top climate and energy person, just came out as pro-nuclear and said she was going to be lobbying to keep those plants open. But our view is that there's not, that there's an ambition missing from, and where all the excitement and the energy is in terms of developing nuclear is it's at the MIT campus. It's at UC Berkeley. It's not at DOE. It's not in the industry. And frankly, when we look at signs of hope on nuclear technology, we definitely look at China. They have there are like 4 or 5 different technologies that they're pursuing, and each of them is getting like $1 billion in R&D funding. So we're like, that's fine. If we're not going to do it, we should help China to do it. We should give them our information, and we should have some joint agreement there. But yeah, unfortunately, the nuclear industry is not. They've done a bit better, but they're a very conservative group, and just trying to kind of protect what they have.
Where do you see the next focus innovations that we need to carry us into the next energy transition?
Where do I think the innovations? Where should we be focused on? Yeah, I mean, I think we still we don't want to put all of our eggs in one basket. So I think obviously we want to do a lot of R&D. I should back up and just say, I think we invest too little in this. We spend about $5 billion a year in energy innovation in the United States. We spend about $32 billion a year on the National Institutes of Health, which does health innovation. A lot of our pharmaceutical drugs comes out of that. We spend about $80 billion a year in Department of Defense innovation. And I think energy, because of its environmental importance and national security importance, deserves a larger budget. And I think that money should be distributed among the different technologies. And you have to have a separate strategy for solar, a separate strategy for wind, a separate strategy for nuclear, a separate strategy for carbon capture and storage. And it's usually a mix of both sort of basic science, applied research, and then some subsidies for deployment. In the case of shale gas, we funded basically all aspects of the innovation program, and we did it for 30 years. And so that should be our time horizon. So I think we should do 30, maybe 50 billion a year in the United States, and the other countries should go up. And we should have a long-term view. Americans don't go, hey, we haven't solved cancer yet, so we should cut the NIH budget. We know that that's a really important public good, and I think that's something that Republicans and Democrats should be able to agree on.
What do you see in the cards about battery technology? We know that batteries are a limiting factor now. We need more efficient, more effective, lighter batteries with more capacity that will hold a charge longer. What's happening?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing to understand about so batteries really have made a difference for the transition to electric cars. And we saw big improvements with investments from the stimulus and getting new battery factories here. Obviously, the transition from nickel cadmium to lithium batteries made a huge difference. So we would favor also more money for R&D for batteries, as well as military style procurement. Right now, we do energy subsidies a lot like we do crop subsidies, and we should do it much more like the way the military does it, where the military will spend a lot of money on the next generation, the next prototype. The classic example is jet engines. We have really inexpensive air travel, in part because the DoD spent several decades buying the most advanced jet turbines. And it was, a lot of it was corrupt. There was hearings, there were scandals. But at the end of the day, we got better jet turbines. And I think we should be doing the same thing for batteries with a much bigger spend. I will just note that I think that the batteries really do matter for transport, because I think electric vehicles could be a really important part of a climate solution. I'm a little bit more skeptical about utility scale storage. That's the idea of a society powered 100% by renewables, is that when the sun's not shining, the wind's not blowing, you're going to have these batteries. But every time you convert energy, either from natural flows or stocks into usable energy as electricity, or back from that electricity to batteries, and then from the batteries to electricity, you get a big penalty, a big loss of energy. And so one question is just, we're not getting big breakthroughs in utility scale storage. I mean, Germany right now in its transitions to renewables is just doing some pretty basic energy storage stuff, like pumping, when they have the electricity, pumping water uphill, back into a reservoir, and then running it back over the turbines when they don't have it. And that's the technology that's been around for
And I was
very long
mentioning
time.
to Michael over dinner, we had a visit today from the Tesla Motor Company, because the city of Long Beach is eager to partner with Tesla. They believe that they could take a large municipal building, and you can either charge it up when the electricity rates are low, and then use that during peak times, or you can charge it up with solar or wind. And the mayor wanted us to at least meet with them, so we did.
Yeah, I agree. You need we call it a portfolio approach. You can't put all your eggs in one basket. You haven't mentioned hydrogen much. One thing that Germany is doing is they've got 30 to 40% of their wind that's curtailed. Can't use it, and so they let it spin free. They've now put in P2G, power to gas, where they're running electrolyzers and creating hydrogen, injecting it in the natural gas pipelines. And it's not efficient, but on the other hand, it's free energy that would otherwise be wasted. So that is there's a lot of work being done that hydrogen can be grid level, power plant level storage, and also hydrogen cars are potential. We're working on those. A big potential to solve the longer distance, kind of fully replace conventional vehicles with fuel cells. That seems very, very doable. The problem with batteries is until we get another generation of breakthrough, batteries are good for shorter distances and smaller cars, whereas fuel cells you can do full-size cars and trucks and buses and that kind of thing.
Right. And obviously the challenge with hydrogen, as you know, is that it actually you have people don't realize how amazing gasoline is, because there's so much, the carbon actually helps to get greater energy density. So when you go from gasoline to hydrogen, you actually lose that energy density. And then of course the other issue is that you have to have refueling stations. So part of the reason that we're a bit more optimistic about electric cars is that you already have the refueling stations, because we have electricity almost everywhere. But again, I'm like, yeah, why wouldn't we be doing R&D why wouldn't we be doing more R&D and demonstration into hydrogen? It merits it for sure.
So I want to pick up, I think we do need more diverse portfolios, and they will vary from region to region. There are places in the ocean where you could get good tidal energy, but there are other places that it doesn't make any sense. Same as with waves and so on. So the diversity will vary from one area to another. We'll take one more question. Anybody have one? Okay. You didn't even pay tuition.
Busted.
Along in the portfolio, I was just wondering, nobody's talking about conservation, and I just wonder, when you're talking about that one slide that you have regarding Germany and how much energy they use. In our country, we seem like we use a lot more energy than we need, and I see it wasted in so many different areas. I wondered if you could address that.
Yeah, I'm sure you're right. I mean, the challenge, I think the first thing to remember about Europe, the big difference between our energy consumption and Europe's is population density. So, there's just a lot more people on a lot smaller amount of land in Europe. So that means that their buildings go higher, they go up higher, more people live in apartments than here. and the distance that people commute to work is much shorter. So a big part of the difference for higher energy consumption here is just through no fault of our own, and it's not because we're gluttons. It's just because we spread out, as we settled in the United States. So I mean, I flew over LA today. I mean, it's just amazing, the sprawl, right? I mean, it's just a huge area, so that's not an easy thing to fix, obviously. I mean, I think we can all kind of go, it'd be better if we all lived in apartments, but people love living in homes, and they're probably not going to give those up, and they're probably not going to go away. So I think that there's certainly something to be said for conserving and for not being wasteful. I just don't think that much of the difference can be explained by conscious choices made by Europeans. It's more by just the societies that they were born into, where they don't drive 45 minutes to work. A lot of them can walk to work, or a much shorter 5 or 10 minute drive, and that allows obviously much more mass transit, that kind of density, so they can get on trains and buses much more easily than we can.
Well, next week we will have Michael's colleague Ted Nordhaus here, and we'll have Steve Chazen, who is the CEO of the Occidental Petroleum Company. They used to have its headquarters here in California. They've moved to Texas, but he's flying from Texas just to be with all of you. So, Michael, thank you for a very stimulating evening.
Thank you.